Good. Well, my name is Michael Overhola, and I'd like to welcome you to the first of 8 enrichment presentations that I'm going to be giving over the next several days during our cruise from Rome to Dubai. So my background is in writing, editing, journalism, and publishing. People often ask me as I teach, and I have taught, but that's not the main thing that I do. And over the years, I've written several fiction and nonfiction books, and worked for, started, or run a number of publications, including newsletters, magazines, and newspapers. I currently live about 40 miles north of San Antonio in a region known as the Texas Hill Country, and I run a small nonprofit association called the Gnosis Project, which provides support for small, mostly underfunded overseas museums, and I run a small publishing company called Skirmisher Publishing. So that is my background, just to give you an idea of where I'm coming from. Today, we're going to be discussing the mythology and religion associated with the region we've been sailing through during this first part of our cruise, namely the world of the Greeks and the Romans and the lands throughout the Mediterranean that they inhabited. This subject is actually much more complex than one might think, especially anyone who has some background in the myths and legends of the Romans. They really, or Greeks and Romans, they really get simplified to a great extent, and it's actually extremely complex. But we're going to simplify it a bit today by approaching it through an examination of the gods and goddesses that were revered in the classical world. So that is the narrow focus we're going to take. And in the course of this presentation, for a couple of reasons, we're going to be paying special attention to the appearances of these deities and to the symbols and iconography associated with them. And the main reason for this is a practical one, and it is so that you will be better able to recognize the various gods and goddesses when you see them depicted in statuary, mosaics, and other artworks, both during this trip and future ones you'll take. And that is something that I found can really make experiences like that much more fun and satisfying. If you look at a statue and you can actually identify, because of some of the tells or the symbols or the iconography, the deity that you're looking at. So we're going to focus a bit on that. I don't know how many more Greek deities or Roman deities we're going to see depictions of on the rest of this trip, but if we do see some, then hopefully this will be of some help to you. And if you saw some things at the Acropolis that you might have been wondering about, maybe we'll be able to clarify some of that today. So ancient Greek religion encompassed the beliefs, rituals, and mythology associated with both popular public religion and cult practices on mainland Greece and the islands and coasts of Ionia in Asia Minor, which we now know as Turkey. That was part of the Greek world. There were very, very many Greek colonies and cities there. And this area extended as far as Sicily and southern Italy. You might have recalled hearing sometime earlier in the trip that there were Greek colonies throughout Sicily, that they were some of the first city builders in Sicily. And really, this goes as far west as the Western Mediterranean. What we now know as Marseille was founded by the Greeks sometime in the first millennium BC. I don't know, maybe 5th century BC. So these are the beliefs that were held by people in one form or another, with many regional variations, throughout a vast area. Most ancient Greeks recognized the 12 major gods and goddesses believed to dwell on Mount Olympus in northeastern Greece, and therefore known as the Olympians. And it is to them that we will be giving most of our attention today. Worship of these key deities, which we can see depicted here in a painting by the Renaissance artist Raphael, existed throughout the Greek world, and they included Zeus, Hera, Poseidon, Demeter, Athena, Ares, Aphrodite, Apollo, Artemis, Hephaestus, Hermes, and either Hestia or Dionysus. So at different periods of time, the composition of the 12 Olympians changed. And I think there were some regional variants too, but mostly it's those deities that made up the 12 Olympians. And we're going to look at the characteristics of all of them in the course of this presentation. But there were many other gods and goddesses worshipped by the Greeks, along with specific aspects of major deities. In many cases, for example, the Olympian gods and goddesses had different epithets or titles that distinguish specific characteristics or portfolios, and which sometimes reflected the absorption and conflation of other local deities. So we might have an Artemis who has a specific region associated with their name, and she might not have started off as Artemis. She might have started off as some other local deity, and when Greeks settled that area, they absorbed the cult of that deity into their religion and said, well, she is Diana or Artemis of the Colchis or whatever. And we'll look at that a bit going forward. Some of my favorites of these epithets, of these specific portfolios, apply to the god Hermes, and they include Hermes Agoreos. So Hermes was venerated as Hermes Agoreos, Hermes of the marketplace, and Hermes Anodios, a reference to his role as a god of the road and travel. So if you see a reference to Hermes Anodios, we're talking specifically about his aspect as a god of the road and a god who protects people who are traveling along them. And we'll look at a few of the other epithets applying to these deities. So just because you had a deity who had a specific, very broad portfolio, you'd very often have a temple or a cult or a local focus of worship that really focused on one of these specific characteristics. And it bears mention before we move on that Greek religion was not regulated by any central text like a Bible. And it was rather an amalgam of beliefs that developed over a course of centuries and which were observed by a widespread people that shared, to a great extent, a common language and culture. It was also not a canonical religion in that it was generally acceptable to create new tales about the gods as a device for conveying various concepts or ideas. So while impiety against the gods might be something people needed to avoid, heresy against the religion itself was not generally an issue. More so with the Romans, who we'll look at now. Presence of Greeks on the Italian peninsula prior to the rise of Rome influenced the religious practices of local peoples like the Etruscans, and helped lay a basis for much of the ancient Roman religion that would follow. Whereas the Romans worshiped many of the same deities, however, it was often not as simple as those gods and goddesses being given Latinized names, and they often had different mythological traditions altogether. So we sometimes hear that Greek and Roman religion were the same. On the one hand, the gods have Greek names, and on the other hand, there are equally the parallel gods, equivalent gods that have Latinized names. And that's true up to a point, but only a point. And there were actually some distinct characteristics. Roman religion was much more rigid and doctrinaire than that of the Greeks. It was a part of daily life for ordinary Romans. Every home had a household shrine at which prayers and libations to the family's domestic deities were offered, and neighborhood shrines and sacred places like springs and groves were scattered throughout the city of Rome and throughout the cities that eventually became part of the Roman Empire. Religious observances also formed the basis for the structure of the Roman calendar. According to legend, most of Rome's religious institutions could be traced to its founders, some of whom were reputed to commune directly with the gods. And this is, of course, something that we find in most religions. The founders were reputed to have a direct channel of communication with the deity or deities in question. Roman religion was based on knowledge and the correct practice of prayer, ritual, and sacrifice, not on faith or dogma, and maintaining good relations with the gods and demonstrating piety toward them was seen as a vital element in a unified and expansionist state that ultimately became an empire. And we see the symbols of the Roman deities on everything from military standards and shields and public edifices. So the idea that Rome existed because it had the support of the gods was something that many Romans were very conscious of. Romans also looked for common ground between their major gods and those of the Greeks. They revered the Greeks as they revered Greek culture and really looked up to it. They aspired to it in many ways. And they adapted Greek myths and iconography for Latin literature and Roman art. Their religion, therefore, developed into a dynamic blend of ancestral beliefs, adherence to tradition and the way of the ancestors, Greek religious belief, and many of the practices of peoples brought under Roman rule. This ultimately included Christianity, of course, and it became the official religion of the empire in AD 380. So that's the ultimate example of the conflation of a local religion. So we're going to take a look at some of the deities that the Greeks and Romans revered as part of their respective religious traditions, starting with Zeus. Zeus, king of the deities of Mount Olympus, was the god of the sky and thunder in ancient Greek religion and known to the Romans as Jupiter. His symbols included the thunderbolt, eagle, bull, oak tree, and anything related to the concept of law or justice. And he was frequently depicted by artists either as seated in majesty or as standing, possibly while striding forward, with a thunderbolt leveled in his raised right hand. So if you have a statue of a deity and it's not marked or labeled in any way, but it's of a bearded man, really a very archetypal god image sitting on a throne, then it's very possibly Zeus. If he's standing and stepping forward and has his hand raised, it could be Zeus, but it might be Poseidon, because when the thunderbolt in his hand got lost over the centuries, we don't know whether it was a thunderbolt or a trident that he was originally holding. So sometimes you have to look for other tells. But this is pretty much how you would identify Zeus. Zeus is believed to have been born in a cave on Mount Ida on the island of Crete, and it is possible to visit one possible location for this site. And that's kind of a neat thing about the Greek deities. Most of them have origin stories that tell us specifically where they came from. So in many cases, we can visit the site where a particular deity was born, or reputed to have been. Zeus was the child of the primordial titans Kronos and Rhea, and after leading a revolt to overthrow their generation of deities, he became respected as an all-father who was chief of the gods and who assigned roles to the others. And All-Father is one of the titles, one of the epithets that's given to Odin in Norse religion. And we get very, very, very many parallels between Zeus and other Indo-European deities. So there is a very credible line of thought that Zeus and Odin and a number of other deities from Europe and what was used to be referred to as the Near East all derive from a single deity that evolved into this All-Father. So the words Zeus and Deus, God, are etymologically related. So Zeus, in a sense, is the quintessential God image in classical religion. Zeus is traditionally said to have been married to Hera, the goddess Hera, who we'll look at in a moment, and with her to have fathered the deities Ares, Hebe, and Hephaestus. He was also infamous for his erotic escapades, and these resulted in many other heroic or divine offspring, including Athena, Apollo, Aphrodite, Artemis, Hermes, Persephone, Dionysus, Perseus, Heracles, or Hercules, Helen of Troy, Minos, and the Muses. And we'll look at some of them as we move ahead. Hera, known as Juno to the Romans, was the goddess of women, marriage, family, and childbirth, and as the daughter of the Titans Kronos and Rhea, was both sister and wife to Zeus, and ruled over Mount Olympus as queen of the gods, queen of heaven, Regina Caeli, to the Romans. Her symbols include the pomegranate, peacock feather, cow, lily, lotus, cuckoo, panther, scepter, throne, and lion. So these are the things that we're looking for in mosaics or other representations that could indicate to us that we're looking at a representation or reference to Hera. She's frequently depicted as being solemn, even severe and majestic, frequently shown wearing a high cylindrical crown called a polos, but other goddesses are shown wearing that sometimes as well, so it's not proof positive that we're looking at Hera if she's wearing that. And often seated on a throne or sometimes in a chariot drawn by peacocks. So peacocks, I don't think they're associated with any other deities to the extent they are with Hera. That's a very good tell for who you might be looking at. Hera served as both the patroness and protectress of married women and was invoked in wedding ceremonies and other references to marriage and the like. One of this goddess's defining characteristics, in fact, was her jealousy and inclination to seek vengeance against Zeus's numerous lovers and illegitimate children, which were an affront to the sanctity of her marriage to him. And everyone here has heard of Heracles or Hercules. His 12 labors were precipitated by Hera trying to cause trouble for him because he was an illegitimate child of Zeus. So there are very many stories in Greek mythology about Hera striking out either directly against Zeus or indirectly against him through his children. And we have the Romans to thank, by the way, for many of the still existing statues of classical deities, and that is because so many of them worked with durable materials like marble. All right? When we think of classical statues, I venture to say most people think of these white marble statues. But Greek craftsmen preferred to work in bronze if they could. Bronze is very expensive. It was always expensive. But a majority of bronze statues were subsequently cannibalized and used for other things. So the Greeks, if they could have created all of their statues in bronze, would have done that. Those bronze statues were melted down for any number of purposes. Thousands of them were melted down and destroyed in the Middle Ages and converted into cannon. So if you go to somewhere like Rhodes or any of these places throughout the Aegean or Mediterranean that have medieval fortifications and you see bronze cannon, those bronze cannon were very likely statues of classical deities at some point 1,000 years earlier. That was their original incarnation, and then they were destroyed and melted down and turned into weaponry during the Middle Ages. But the Romans did a lot of very affordable and mass-produced stone statues, and that is why, to a great extent, we have the durable record that we do. Poseidon, known as Neptune to the Romans, was the god of the sea, storms, horses, and earthquakes, and his symbols include, of course, horses, tridents, fish, dolphins, and bulls. So those are the images that we're looking for with regard to Poseidon. Though, just to give full disclosure, those are Minoan dolphins, and they might have been purely artistic in nature. They might not have actually been representative of Poseidon at all in any overt way. So Poseidon was revered as a protector of seafarers, and so that's especially relevant to those of us who cruise frequently, and also served as the patron deity of many Hellenic cities and colonies. He's also sometimes said to dwell in and rule over the islands of Atlantis. So Plato wrote about Atlantis to a great extent. The image we have of Atlantis was provided to us by Plato, and he claimed that Poseidon was the ruler of Atlantis at one point. There are numerous ancient literary references to Poseidon that give us insights into his characteristics and temperament. In the Iliad, for example, who here has read the Iliad, by the way? We'll refer to it a few times. Okay. Who here who read the Iliad read it because they had to read it in college or high school? Yeah, everyone, right? Exactly. In the Iliad, for example, Poseidon sides with the Greeks in their war against the Trojans. And in the Odyssey, the other great work attributed to Homer that follows the action of the Iliad, he harasses and impedes Odysseus after the hero blinds his son, the Cyclops Polyphemus. And we will, in fact, be looking at that episode in a bit more detail in one of our upcoming presentations called Sailing the Wine Dark Sea. So some days from now, we'll be having a presentation called Sailing the Wine Dark Sea, which will be about the Odyssey and the travails of the hero Odysseus. Demeter known to the Romans as Ceres, was a goddess of the harvest and agriculture, presiding over grains and the fertility of the earth, and her symbols included the cornucopia, wheat, torch, and bread. And even though Demeter is perhaps less well known, Demeter and Ceres are less well known by name than a lot of these deities, her image has been incorporated into lots of municipal or state instruments like money. In the 19th century, you saw a lot of banknotes. I think there were Confederate banknotes used throughout the southern United States, for example, that used Demeter or Ceres as an image. So her imagery is something that is intuitively very familiar to people, even if they don't know her by name, because it's been included in so many contexts. Demeter's epithets included Ceto, she of the grain, referring to her role as the giver of food or grain, and Thesmophoros, or law bringer, because of the relationship between agriculture and civilization. And of course, agriculture and civilization go hand in hand. You can't have cities if you don't have intensive agriculture. Hunter-gatherers don't have cities. So the Greeks were very aware of this and saw the connection between agriculture, intensive agriculture, and the existence of cities. In her role as the goddess of law, as the law bringer, she presided over sacred law and the cycles of life and death. So there was this perceived connection between natural law and human legislated law. And she and her daughter Persephone were the central figures of the Eleusinian mysteries, an ancient religious tradition that actually predated worship of the Olympian pantheon. Athena, known to the Romans as Minerva, was the goddess of wisdom, handicrafts, and warfare. Her symbols included owls, olive trees, snakes, armor, helmets, spears, and a shield or talisman bearing the image of a Medusa's head. And she's usually depicted wearing a helmet and holding a spear. So who among you who went into Athens yesterday saw some depiction of Athena that you can identify through her symbols, through the owl or some of the other symbols? Okay, good. Athena was believed to have been born from the head of her father Zeus, to have actually split his head open and stepped out of it fully armed and armored. So she was born as a fully formed adult warrior. And along with Aphrodite and Hera, she was one of the three goddesses whose feud caused the Trojan War. So the Trojan War is the subject of the Iliad, one of the most famous works of antiquity. And there was a contest between three goddesses that ended up sparking that war. And Athena was one of them. Athena was regarded as the patron and protectress of a number of cities across Greece, the most notable, of course, being Athens, which derives its name from her. She was also a patroness of heroic endeavor and rendered aid to a number of heroes, including Odysseus, as we will see in our talk on the Odyssey, but also Heracles, Bellerophon, Jason, and Perseus, who gave her the Medusa head that appears on her shield. And we don't have any images of Perseus in this presentation, but I saw some when I was visiting an art museum in Catania. Perseus is always a fun one to be able to pick out. A lot of the things these figures were holding would get lost over the centuries, but if you ever see a figure who's holding one hand up like this and one hand down like this, and he doesn't have anything in his hands, but he has one leg raised forward like he's running, this is going to be Perseus in all likelihood. And his lower hand almost always had a sickle-shaped sword in it. His upper hand almost always had the head of a Medusa in it, and his tail are going to be the feet because he's wearing winged shoes and he's actually flying, which is why he's depicted with one leg up to sort of represent that he's flying. So that's a fun one to keep your eye out for next time you're in any kind of museum that has classical art. Two of Athena's earliest epithets included Polios and Poliokos, both derived from the Greek root word for city. Okay, so she's associated with the concept of the city in general. And her temples were generally located within the fortified Acropolis at the heart of a city. And the most famous example of this is certainly the temple dedicated to her, known as the Parthenon on the Acropolis of Athens. And there is no the Acropolis. People periodically refer to the Acropolis as if there's only one. Every Greek city had an Acropolis. Every Greek city had a defensible high point that in the earliest days people would flee to when the city was attacked by pirates or raiders. Everybody was a pirate at a certain point. 1000 BC, people were either defending their cities against pirates or running piratical raids on other people's cities. So people would flee up to these high points called acropoli, the acropolises. And then these became more heavily fortified over the centuries and had temples and treasuries and mints and other critical infrastructure established in them. Athena was also known as Ergane for her role as patroness of weaving, and as Athena Promachos in her role as a military commander, and as Athena Parthenos, or virginal Athena, and this is the aspect, of course, of hers that is commemorated with the Parthenon. So the Parthenon is dedicated to the aspect of Athena as a virginal deity. Ares, known to the Romans as Mars, was the god of war. And his symbols included the sword, spear, shield, helmet, chariot, flaming torch, dog, boar, and vulture. And some of you might recall that we mentioned that the torch was a symbol of Demeter. So we've got to look at context when we're looking at iconography. The torch is a symbol of Demeter because she is a goddess of civilization, and civilization depends on fire. The torch is a symbol of Ares because the torch can be used to light things on fire and burn them down. So we're looking at a very different context for the torch in the case of each of them. Ares was the son of Zeus and Hera, and represented not just martial skill and valor, which of course he did, but also the violence and carnage of war, in contrast to his sister, Athena, who was a goddess of strategy, tactics, and leadership. So they were seen as two sides of the same coin. They were both gods of war, but had very different portfolios when it came to war. Ares' sons, Phobos, or fear, and Deimos, or terror, took the form of horses, pulled his war chariot, and his sister and sometimes consort Enyo, or discord, sometimes accompanied him into combat. And I'm not sure if our astronomer, who was on here before me, mentioned that the two satellites, the two moons of Mars and Ares are, the planet Mars is named for the god Mars, and the two sons of Mars are Phobos and Deimos, named for these two sons of his who took the form of horses, fear and terror, and pulled his chariot. Ares was somewhat of a problematic figure to the Greeks because he embodied so much of what was terrible about war. And places and objects associated with him are imbued with a dangerous, militarized, or savage quality. Zeus, Ares' own father, tells him, in fact, in the Iliad, that he is the most hateful to him of all the gods. Zeus tells that to his son, that he is, of all the gods, Ares is the most hateful to him. And he was also well known as the lover of Aphrodite, the goddess of love, despite the fact that she was married to Hephaestus, the god of craftsmanship. Ares held a somewhat more revered status among the Romans in his guise as Mars, however, and was viewed by them as a guardian deity and a father of the Roman people. And the Romans were much more accepting of all of Mars's characteristics. Julius Caesar, for example, claimed to be descended from both Aphrodite and Mars, so presumably as a result of a illicit union between the two of them. So this is where we can see a good example of a difference between Greek and Roman religion. The Greeks looked at Ares with a great deal of trepidation and saw him mostly as a negative force, whereas the Romans, who of course were very militarized and expansionist, saw him as a father of their people. So very, very different roles. Apollo was one of the most complex and important of the Olympian deities in Greek and Roman religion, and was considered to be the most beautiful god, an ideal of athletic youthfulness, and the most Greek of all the gods. He's one of the few deities to also be known by the same name to the Romans. So we don't have an alternate name for Apollo. Apollo was Apollo to everyone. And what we're looking at here on the left, by the way, is kind of interesting. We mentioned before that a lot of the statuary we have, the extant statuary we have is marble or other durable materials. This is a much, much earlier depiction of Apollo. This is a statue known as the Apollo of Veii, and it originally stood upon a temple structure built by the Etruscans. So this is a terracotta rather than a marble statue of Apollo, and it predates really the formation of Roman religion as we described it. So Apollo is a very, very old god who was worshipped before these religions became established in the form that we ultimately knew them. So Apollo was the son of Zeus and the goddess Leto, and the twin brother of Artemis, goddess of the hunt, and was a god of archery, music, song, dance, poetry, truth, prophecy, healing, the sun, and light. And as the patron deity of Delphi, Apollo was also the prophetic deity of the Delphic oracle. So we've all heard of the Oracle of Delphi, I assume. The Oracle of Delphi received her information ultimately from Apollo. His symbols include the laurel wreath, Python, the python being a giant snake that he killed in one of the stories associated with him, the raven, swan, bow, and arrows, and the lyre, which he is reputed to have invented. Stringed instruments in general, Apollo was reputed to have invented. Medicine and healing are also associated with Apollo, whether through the god himself or mediated through his son Asclepius. But Apollo was also able to inflict sickness and plague with his arrows. So if a plague swept through a city, it was generally considered that somehow Apollo had become displeased. Apollo is also known as the protector of children and to be concerned with their health and education, to be the patron of herdsmen and shepherds and protector of their herds and flocks, to protect people from evil and disease, and to be the patron of foreigners, fugitives, and refugees. And he's also known to have encouraged the founding of new communities and the establishment of laws for them. Artemis, known to the Romans as Diana, was the goddess of the hunt, the wilderness, wild animals, the moon, and chastity. And her symbols include the bow, arrows, hunting knives, stags, hunting dogs, and the moon. She was the daughter of Zeus and Leto, and the twin sister of Apollo. Artemis was the patron and protector of young girls, and was reputed to both inflict illness upon women and to relieve them of it, and was somewhat ironically, as a virginal goddess who was sworn never to marry, revered as a goddess of childbirth and midwifery. So I don't know how that came about, but she was considered to be a goddess of midwifery, even though she never bore any children herself. Artemis was one of the most widely venerated of the ancient Greek deities, and her temple at Ephesus was one of the seven wonders of the ancient world. Who here has been to Ephesus? And I suspect there are very few of you who have been to the site of the temple of Diana or Artemis there. Has anyone been to the site of the temple? It's a little undeveloped, and mostly there are a couple of other things people do when they go to Ephesus. But it is something that people can visit. I think it's just a little underwhelming because it hasn't really been developed as much as a number of the other sites. But we will be looking at the seven wonders of the ancient world in one of our upcoming talks. I think we just call it Seven Wonders of the Ancient World. It's going to be coming up in a few days. So once again, if you're interested in learning more about the Temple of Diana, Temple of Artemis at Ephesus, we'll be talking about that along with the other six wonders of the ancient world, including one dedicated to Zeus. Aphrodite, known as Venus to the Romans, was the goddess of love, beauty, pleasure, passion, and procreation, and she was the patron goddess of prostitutes. Her symbols include dolphins, myrtles, roses, doves, sparrows, swans, scallop shells, girdles, mirrors and pearls. And she's a very familiar image too, because she was, so many depictions of her really began to appear in the era of the Renaissance. So one of the most famous examples of Venus is Birth of Venus by Botticelli, which shows her standing on a scallop shell. So she is one of the more iconic deities and one whose image we are very familiar with. Aphrodite's origins, however, are less clear than that with many of the Olympian deities, and there are a number of stories with regard to them. In some sources, she is the daughter of Zeus and the goddess Dione, and was born on the island of Cyprus. So there is a place on Cyprus that is attributed as the birthplace of Aphrodite. Others assert that she was born in the waters off the island of Kythera, which is south of the Peloponnesian Peninsula, and that she was generated from the foam, aphros, produced by the Titan Uranus's genitals after his son Kronos cut them off and flung them into the sea. So Kronos castrated his father, threw his genitals into the sea, and where it foamed up, Aphrodite was supposedly born. Her epithets thus include Cyprus, Lady of Cyprus, and Cytherea, Lady of Cythera, as well as Aphrodite Urania, or Heavenly Aphrodite, and Aphrodite Pandemos, or Aphrodite of the people. So she had many aspects as well. Aphrodite was married to Hephaestus, as we noted before, the god of craftsmen, but was routinely unfaithful to him and had many lovers, including Ares, the god of war. She was also, along with Athena and Hera, one of the three goddesses whose feud resulted in the start of the Trojan War, and she plays a major role in the Iliad. She turns up again and again in it. Hephaestus, known to the Romans as Vulcan, was the god of craftsmen and artisans, blacksmiths, metallurgy, carpenters, sculptors, fire, and volcanoes. And his symbols include a smith's hammer, an anvil, and a pair of tongs. And he was adopted in a lot of imagery, particularly in the 19th century, as industrialization became more widespread. He was adopted as a symbol of this. Does anyone here happen to know where this statue, this, I think, iron statue of Hephaestus is from? Does anyone know? I think it's he's identified as Vulcan in that statue. Do I see any hands out here? Birmingham. It's from Birmingham, Alabama. Are you from Birmingham? Okay, right. So I thought it was kind of fun to be able to find some statues that transcended just the museums and historic sites of the Mediterranean. And this is one that I had seen and wanted to include here. So this is Vulcan or Hephaestus from Birmingham, Alabama. Hephaestus was either the son of Zeus and Hera, or of Hera alone, something that was possible with the gods. He was fairly unique among the gods as being described as ugly and deformed, and is often conceived of as having short, twisted legs. And there are all sorts of stories as to why this might be the case. One is that Hera was so horrified by his appearance when he was born that she threw him off of Mount Olympus. But being a god, he couldn't die and was just maimed from the fall. Another is that he interceded to help his mother Hera when his father Zeus was beating her, and that Zeus threw him off of Mount Olympus, at which point his legs were broken, and he was thereafter described as being crippled, as having trouble walking because his legs were twisted and not properly healed. As a craftsman, Hephaestus forged all the weapons for the gods in Olympus and was worshipped in the various manufacturing and industrial centers of Greece and in some of the Americas as well. Notably, Athens, where a temple dedicated to him can still be found at the foot of the Acropolis. So some of you might have noticed, if you were at the Acropolis, either on this trip or previous one, that there is a mid-sized classical temple at the foot of the Acropolis. It's in incredibly good shape, and that was a temple to Hephaestus. We've got just a couple more deities here, and then if they don't start flashing lights, I'll take any questions you might have. Hermes, known to the Romans as Mercury, was the god of trade, heralds, merchants, commerce, roads, thieves, trickery, travelers, and athletes. And he was the son of Zeus and the Pleiad, as of the Pleiades, Maya, and one of the youngest of the Olympian gods. Hermes' symbols include the talaria, or winged shoes, the kerykeion, or caduceus, a winged staff with two snakes entwined around it, the petasos, or winged helmet, a satchel or pouch, and the tortoise, lyre, and rooster. But if you see a figure with winged shoes or a winged helmet, it isn't always Hermes, because he was the patron of many heroes, and he would frequently loan these items to heroes. So we mentioned Perseus before, who slew the Medusa, or the Gorgon known as Medusa, and he's wearing winged shoes. So if we see the winged shoes, we might say, oh, well, this is Hermes. But no, in that case, it's somebody that Hermes bestowed a gift upon, to whom he loaned his shoes. So once again, you've got to look for different symbols in iconography to walk in who you're talking about. Hermes was also depicted in the form of Herma, as we can see here on the left. You notice this is a pillar that has a set of genitals at about waist level, and then a head at the top. And these were stylized sculptures used to mark things like boundaries and road intersections. So there would have been thousands of these things throughout ancient Greece. Like as you approached a city, there might be one to mark the boundary of the city. If you were at a road intersection, there might be one there to indicate that it really is an official road going in both directions, whatever. So these were found throughout ancient Greece. Hermes was a key deity with interests in communication, travel, and commerce, and served as the emissary and messenger of the gods, as a deity of boundaries and their transgression, and as the patron of travelers, thieves, graves, and heralds. And as the Greek gods have been, as their imagery has been co-opted in modern media, Hermes is often shown as a Tinkerbell-like figure or a little fairy with wings, and this is never how the Greeks or Romans would have depicted him. He would have always been depicted as a young but mature, very virile male, almost always bearded. So he was never reduced or diminished in his appearance in the classical world. In his guise as Hermes Psychopompus, Hermes was the conductor of souls into the afterlife and was reputed to be able to move freely between the worlds of the mortal and divine. So Hermes could go anywhere. He was also sometimes regarded as a trickster who outwitted other gods, either on behalf of people or simply for his own satisfaction. And there are different counterparts to that in other traditions. So the free flow of travel and commerce, these things were sacred to Hermes. And these, of course, were important in the ancient world. Cities had to be able to trade. People had to be able to travel. They had to be able to travel safely. So it was an affront to Hermes to prey upon travelers, to impede their travel, to impede commerce. And his imagery, especially his Roman form of Mercury, really gets picked up a lot in the 19th century as well. And then finally, rounding out our 12 Olympians, were generally either the goddess Hestia or Dionysus. So Hestia, known as Vesta of the Romans, was the virgin goddess of the hearth. Domesticity, the family, the home, and the state of the nation. And her symbols include the hearth and its fire. She was the daughter and firstborn child of the Titans Kronos and Rhea. Hestia received the first offerings at every sacrifice in the household, and with the establishment of a new colony, Greeks colonized frequently. Once there were too many people living in one city, a bunch would break off and go found their own community somewhere. With the founding of a new colony, flame from her public hearth in the mother city would be carried to the new settlement. And presumably any of you have been to Rome, have heard of the Vestal Virgins. Are you all familiar with that term? This was a cult of young women who were dedicated to Hestia or Vesta, and they were priestesses who had to remain virgins throughout their life. And if they did not, it was considered that this was impious and put the city of Rome at risk. So Vestal virgins who did not maintain their virginity were buried alive. That was the penalty for that. So the Romans took this stuff very seriously and responded to infractions pretty harshly. Oh, we're not ready for that yet. Dionysus. So Dionysus, known as Bacchus to the Romans, was the god of the grape harvest, winemaking and wine, of fertility, ritual madness, religious ecstasy, and theater in ancient Greek religion and myth. His symbols include the grapevine, bull, panther, ivy, goat, masks, including the comedy and tragedy masks that are so familiar to everyone. The chalice and the thyrsus, a staff topped with either a pine cone or perhaps more appropriately a hop. It's usually described as a pine cone. I have reason to think it might actually be a hop. Dionysus was generally believed to have been born from the union of Zeus and Persephone, but also by many to have been born twice after being killed and then reborn as the son of Zeus and the mortal woman Semele. Dionysus was primarily associated with wine, its consumption, and the vines and grapes that produce it, all of which were regarded not only as a gift from the god, but also as an incarnation of him, a concept, as some of us know, that would be adopted by subsequent religions. In his role as Eleutherios, an epithet that means the liberator, Dionysus freed from care and fear through wine, music, and dance those who partook of his mysteries. And many of those people were believed to become possessed by the deity himself. So sort of ecstatic possession was an element of his worship. He was also a patron of art, drama, and the theater, and most theaters throughout the classical world were dedicated to him. If you visit a Greek city, such as Athens, frequently you'll see reference on a map or a guide to the Temple of Dionysus. And then you get to the Temple of Dionysus, and what does it look like? Looks like a theater. So the theater at the base of the Parthenon is a temple to Dionysus, and it is, of course, the theater that people use. So a temple of Dionysus and a theater are pretty much synonymous. Dionysus was believed to act as a conduit through which the living and the dead could communicate. So he had a sort of darker aspect. And also to be a deity of epiphany, who was sometimes known as the god that approaches. In many aspects of Dionysus, this being born again, his incarnation in wine, his very appearance was adopted by religions that would follow to include Christianity. So as important as the 12 Olympians were to the Greeks and Romans, many, many others were either actively worshipped by them or for various reasons depicted in works of art by them. Hades, known as to the Romans as Dispater or Orcus, was the god of the dead and the king of the underworld, with which his name became synonymous. And we can see him depicted here on the left. And my understanding is that Hades was never or only very rarely worshipped. So he was depicted at various times, but mostly not in temples where people would go to worship him. He was considered to be a very ominous figure for obvious reasons. But he's not the equivalent of Satan in the Christian tradition. He's the brother of Zeus. He's the brother of Poseidon. They made a determination of who would rule what areas, and he ended up with the underworld. He could have just as easily ended up with the sea or Olympus or whatever. There was an element of chance there. So he's not the devil. He's ominous. He's dark. But he's not necessarily evil. He's a deity, but he's not an Olympian. He doesn't live on Olympus. So Hades was the son of the Titans Kronos and Rhea, like Poseidon and Zeus, and helped his brothers Zeus and Poseidon defeat their father's generation of gods, the Titans, and claim rulership over the cosmos. Hades was often portrayed with his three-headed dog Cerberus, as we can see here on the left, and his symbols include the cornucopia, cypress, narcissus, keys, serpent, mint plant, white poplar, pomegranate, sheep, cattle, screech owl, horse, and chariot. Oops. Persephone, in the middle here, known as Proserpina to the Romans, who we can see depicted here, was the daughter of Zeus and Demeter, and her symbols include the pomegranate, seeds of grain, torches, flowers, and deer. So a lot of her imagery is very similar to that of her mother, Demeter. She became the queen of the underworld through her abduction by and subsequent marriage to Hades, god of the underworld. And she's sometimes depicted as carrying a sheaf of grain, a scepter, or a little box, and is quite often shown as being carried off to the underworld by Hades. Mostly not in statuary, that's awfully elaborate, but if you see a Hades figure carrying a woman, around her waist typically, or slung over her shoulder, this is Persephone being carried off to the underworld. Because the story of Persephone's abduction by Hades represents her personification of vegetation, which emerges in spring and withdraws into the earth after harvest, she's also associated with spring and the fertility of vegetation. So her abduction by Hades was a metaphor to the Greeks. She was allowed, after being abducted, to emerge for 6 months of the year, and this is the period of time in which vegetation begins to grow and reaches maturity and is harvested. And then after the harvest and the onset of winter, this represents the 6 months of the year that she spends in the underworld with her husband. So they were separated half the year, and then she would live with him in the underworld for half the year. And Persephone and her mother Demeter were also the central figures of the Eleusinian mysteries, which promised the initiated an enjoyable afterlife. So this was another key concept of the pre-Olympic pantheon and the Olympic era that was subsequently rolled into religions that would follow. Dionysus, the aforementioned Olympic deity, was also associated with these mysteries. And then finally, last deity we'll look at right here is Asclepius. Asclepius was known to the Romans as Vetiovis. He was a hero and a god of medicine. His symbol was a serpent-entwined staff, which we can see here on the right. And this rod of Asclepius remains a symbol of medicine to this day. Sometimes the caduceus of his father Hermes is adopted as a symbol of medicine, but frequently you'll see a staff with just one serpent around it. Now, this is not a modified version of the caduceus, which is really Hermes' staff of heraldry. It is, in fact, the unique symbol of the god Asclepius. Asclepius was variously believed to be the son of Apollo, or Hermes, and the water nymph Coronis, or of Apollo himself, or of the Apollo and the mortal woman Arsinoe, or by Apollo alone. So there are various stories associated with his origins. And Asclepius represented the healing aspect of the medical arts, and his daughters are Hygeia, goddess of cleanliness. So we see the root of this word. Iaso, goddess of recuperation from illness. Akeso, goddess of the healing process. Egli, goddess of good health. And Panacea, goddess of universal remedies. And hospitals throughout the classical world were in fact known as Asclepions in his honor. And if you ever go to the island of Kos, or if you go to Pergamum near Ephesus, there is a site at those cities and at many other cities throughout the Aegean called the Asclepion, and that just means hospital. The Asclepion was a hospital, and it takes its name from the name of the goddess Asclepius. All right, well, I walked a fine line there between giving you enough information and not giving you too much, and we only had a little attrition, so I think my decisions on this must have been fairly good. I don't know exactly what time it is. I'm going to take questions until a big hook comes out and grabs me, or the lights start to flash, or music comes up, or whatever. So if anyone has any questions.